All right, cool. Like I said, my name is Scott. Hello, there's me about 10 pounds ago. And if you go out and go and Google with Bing for Scott, you will find that there's an epic battle between Scott brand toilet tissue and me. I think I'm somewhere at the bottom or the next page. So when you tweet about this, make sure that you link to my website. We'll see if we can get the Google juice up there. Also, I have a podcast that you might enjoy. It's been around for, if you like NPR, it's kind of like NPR, or Fresh Air. It's been around for 606 episodes. So that is 11 years of podcasting every Thursday for the last decade plus. And it's not just a programmer's podcast, it's just really a technology podcast, and it's non-denominational. Even though I work for Microsoft, I am religiously non-denominational. And by that, I mean I respect PHP people as much as I respect C# people. And I want to point out also that as I've been scrolling here, I'm going past already just 100 shows, and I've still got 500 to go. There are lots of women, lots of people of color, all doing cool stuff. But it's not a diversity and inclusion podcast. It's just an awesome tech podcast with really cool people on it. So I would encourage you to check that out. I'm very proud of it. It's something I do on the side. Now, I've worked for Microsoft for 10 years this month. This is my 10-year anniversary. But I work in Portland, Oregon, which means that I'm safely outside the Redmond reality distortion field. You have to get at least 150 miles outside of Seattle before your brain clears, and then you're allowed to use an iPhone. And since I'm in Portland, it's very much an open source town. In fact, I went to Microsoft 10 years ago specifically to opensource.net. That is why I went there. And for the first 7 years, people just teased me. They thought I was a sellout, and they thought that I went there for the health insurance, which is kind of true. But they also don't remember that before Satya, even though we had another person in the captain's chair, we still were trying from the inside to do open source. And people don't remember that there was a time that we open sourced.net before. I want to point out the date there. It's a real news article from the third time ago that we attempted to open source.net. So 16 years ago we open sourced.net. Did anyone know that? Yeah? Were you there? Did you find it unimpressive as I did? Right? Yeah, so the thing was that we released it to schools. In 2001, GitHub didn't exist. Open source was rather immature. And we basically just zipped up the source code, took all the good parts out, and said, look, we open source.net, don't touch it. Just look at the, it wasn't open source, it was source opened. And it was basically read-only with all the good bits out, and we thought that people would teach it in schools. I wasn't there. I thought it was stupid. But it was an attempt to try to be open at a time when, again, Git didn't exist, GitHub didn't exist, social media didn't exist. The concept of a social developer, and more specifically, the concept of an open source platform for commerce that can support a company and to be both open source and be a company and be consulting and be training and be premium, didn't exist. There wasn't a maturity model for this. But I went there. I was an ASP.NET and ASP programmer, and I went there many years ago to think about this problem. Somewhere around 2007, 2008, we open sourced ASP.NET MVC. There was Web Forms, which was a model for ASP.NET. Model View Controller was going to be the future, so we went and we started to open source that. So we opened the door, and we basically spent 10 years training the legal department at Microsoft to not say no. That was literally what we did, and it took time. We went from no by default to yes by default. And now, in the last 3 years, you're hearing more about open source than ever. And Microsoft is trying to become non-denominational. So what is Microsoft's game in this? How are they going to stick it to you and twist the knife at the end, right? That's how I'm wondering. In fact, Microsoft, now that they have a cloud, and I understand that there's also a bookstore that may have a popular cloud out there, Microsoft wants your for loop. They don't care what your for loop is written in. They just want your for loop. If it's written in PHP or Rails or whatever, we sell compute now. We rent it. So I'd like you to use .NET. I'd like you to use nopCommerce. But if you use something else, great. Just do it on Azure, right? That's the Microsoft's perspective on doing things. Now, In doing that, we open sourced ASP.NET Core and .NET Core, and we're going cross-platform. So .NET Core runs on Linux and runs on Mac, and hopefully people will then use Azure. But there is a scenario where someone could use our products, the entire stack, and not pay us a penny, just as there is that same model for nopCommerce. But when you see value, you pay for value, and that's the hope that we have. Now, we are open source, which brings up a number of interesting questions from a maintenance perspective. Oops. Right now, we are seeing that 40% of downloads of .NET Core are from new developers. That is really interesting, because there was a time in the Microsoft ecosystem where, in the ecosystem of technology, where we were othered. We were the people who were different, right? Oh, you're a Windows developer. Oh, that's adorable. Okay, and then they turn their gaze elsewhere, and then we were just this small, weird, little closed ecosystem. But now we, as open source developers, as users of open source software, have now this whole world opened up to us, and that world is also joining us. 40% of .NET Core downloads are by new developers. That means people who don't know about .NET are starting to think about .NET, starting to think about C#, which is really exciting. We are also seeing, and this is really significant, 62% of the contributions to .NET are from outside Microsoft. Now, if you're a business or a store owner, you might be thinking, wait a second, now random people are going to be contributing to this stack that I am building my storefront on, and that's concerning to me. Every single one of those contributions is treated with the same respect, the same security fixes, the same security eyeballs, the same global perspective that Microsoft employees' source contributions would be. Literally, the code that you checked in, if you did a pull request and said, here's some code, I fixed a bug in .NET Core, and I, as a Microsoft employee, did a similar thing, the exact same process is done that way. And when the code pops out the other end, it is fully and completely supported by Microsoft, regardless of who wrote that. That's a really important thing. And this only means things get better. Now, when we started this, contributions to .NET looked a little bit like this. We went and we used a Power BI dashboard, and we took all of the GitHub data and we queried it, and that was .NET in 2015, .NET in 2016, and in 2017. And there's someone on a boat, I don't know, maybe a cruise ship doing some open source while they were doing that. Now, when you said .NET in the past, .NET typically meant the .NET framework on the Windows platform, right? But .NET now is this big word that means more than just the .NET framework, the thing that is underneath nopCommerce. There are now a series of .NETs, or multiple instances of .NET. There's .NET that runs on Windows, that makes your Xbox games run. There is .NET that makes your iPhone apps and your Android apps run with Xamarin. And then there's this new .NET Core that I'm excited about, and what I want to primarily talk about, which is and is going to enable cross-platform services. That means non-denominational services, services that run great everywhere. Now, one of the things that's really important about this is we want this stuff to be reusable as possible. I don't want to write a .NET application and have it only run on Windows anymore. I want choice. I need the flexibility for my business, and I want to be able to choose my hoster. So what we have is this thing called the .NET Standard Library, and it's nice that the nopCommerce developers have recognized the power of that, because by targeting the .NET Standard, it will enable them in the future to have more agility with what they do. What this allows you to do is write libraries and code that doesn't lock itself to Windows or Linux or Mac or an iPhone. The .NET Standard is a list of agreements. It's a contract. If you type, string.contains, do you know if string.contains exists on an iPhone or an Android? You don't think about that. You know that it's in the standard, and iPhones support that standard, and Windows supports that standard, and Linux supports that standard, and nopCommerce supports that standard, so I know I'll have confidence that in the future I will be in a good spot. And this diagram is really important. This is, I will zoom in a little bit in a moment, but I just want to point this out because this is the one you take a picture of, basically, is what I'm saying. So let's look at this side. Are you seriously taking a selfie right now? Go ahead and do it again. Do it again. The paparazzi in this town are just, it's out of control. All right. So here's the stack. We got compilers at the bottom, all open source. This is really important. All the compilers are open source. That means many eyes make for a better environment and a more secure environment. All the libraries. And then as we go up the stack, there's the .NET Framework 4.x, 4.6 that nopCommerce runs on today. That's the one that's been around. It's hardened. It's positive. It works with Windows. It ships with Windows. It is something that you can rely on. It is a very stable and reliable thing. On top of that, you have traditionally run your stores on .NET Framework 4. Works great. Windows only. ASP.NET Core 2 is out now, and that's the future, right? That's the nopCommerce 4.0 future built on top of our new ASP.NET Web Framework. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Actually, that is good. I'll just take a picture of that there. Okay. Notice how that yellow bar splits across two things here. Remember how I said there's multiple .NETs? There's the one on Windows, and then there's that new smaller one that runs anywhere. It's a little confusing because naming is hard, but ASP.NET Core 2 can run on either one. So if you don't care about Linux and you don't really care about anything I'm talking about, be rest assured that the new ASP.NET Core 2 runs great on Windows and also on .NET Core 2.0. It's like having a car with swappable engines. You can have a hybrid engine or you can have a standard gasoline engine. That's fine. And if you want to drive your cars on dead dinosaur bones, that's fine. But I will have an electric car. And that's totally cool. ASP.NET Core 2 has a lot of great improvements. It has performance improvements, but more importantly, it is flexible enough to run on both of those things, which is important. In some theoretical future, 5 years, 10 years down the road, this will still be supported. It'll still be around. .NET Framework's been around for 15 plus years. It's the stable, reliable one. But this .NET Core 2 is going to allow us to move faster. It's going to allow us to do things that we couldn't do before. And it also was architected at a different time. The internet of 2001, 2002 was a naive internet, right? Today's internet is a lot more aggressive. You've got security issues. You've also got concerns about speed. You've got HTTP2 that is coming now. You've got pipelining. These are all things that are happening to make the internet faster that the older ASP.NET is not ready for. And that's why it's good that we are thinking about things in terms of the new core framework. I don't want to in any way downplay or disrespect the older one, but it's just like we're seeing electric cars happening. Are they going to change the world tomorrow? No, but they are happening, and 10, 15 years down the road, that's going to be the way to do it. And what nopCommerce has wisely chosen to do is straddle the two worlds. It works right now on Windows, but they are slowly and architecturally making the ability to run in both places, which is what they should do. Totally makes sense. So I think we should certainly give them the credit for that, and maybe a little round of applause for 4.0, which is pretty fantastic. So as we move forward at Microsoft, we're taking things like web forms, if some of you are familiar with how web forms worked many years ago, the model view controller, concept of web pages, individual web pages in a page-based framework, and then also web APIs, or APIs that generate JSON. And we are moving to the right here to a unified framework such that all of those things are built in. You don't need multiple frameworks or multiple sub-frameworks in order to do things like support Angular or support JavaScript in interesting ways. ASP.NET Core 2 supports all of those things at the same time, which is cool. And in the future, we are also going to include a thing called SignalR, which will give you real-time communication and things that you couldn't even do before. Now, this can become a confusing problem, especially for business decision makers and store owners who are thinking about, well, they're moving fast. They're releasing a new version every couple of days. That's not cool. Maybe I only want to update once a month or once a year or twice a year. So what we have in the .NET Core space is this concept of the current release, which moves fast. It's like the local. And then we've got the Express. But the Express is absolutely reliable. So we've got long-term support. We will pick a version of the current and say, that's very reliable. That's a stop that people need to think about. And we're going to support it for 3 years. So of nopCommerce will very likely make the similar decision, and they'll pick a long-term support version of .NET to then build on top of, and then that will be then supported for N number of years. So you can choose to go fast and fail fast, fail often, maybe break things, or you could be more reliable and more stable. This is a very similar concept if you're familiar with the Ubuntu operating system. They have new versions coming out all the time, but once a year there's a long-term support version that big companies and enterprises rely on. Now, I apologize to anyone in the room who may be vegan. This is a steak-based analogy. If you like your steak well done, like my dear wife, it's going to be tasteless probably and gray, but it will be reliable and it won't kill you. A well-done steak is a totally reliable thing that won't get you salmonella. If you use Visual Studio and you use libraries from NuGet that are long-term support, it's going to be fine. As you move to medium and medium well, yes, there is a small risk, but community technology previews and betas, they'll have a go-live license, but they can allow you to do fun and interesting new things. As you shift to the left, though, to things like rare and medium rare, the way the good Lord intended us to eat steak. Now you're doing things like building from source. That might be a problem. Let's say that nopCommerce comes out with a version that runs on .NET Core. You pick a long-term support version, a well-done version. You call for support. Hey, I think there's a memory leak in .NET. We will support you. But then I've discovered that maybe you built it from source, right? You ate a bloody steak, and now you're feeling ill. I'm sorry, that's why the little asterisk at the bottom of the menu is there, so you don't sue me, right? I recently discovered that there is a thing before rare. Do you know about this? It's called blue. This is like a raw steak. They just basically slap the cow on the butt and send it out. Like a good doctor could bring this cow back to life. That would be as if I said, I'm running nopCommerce, it's on .NET Core. Where did you get it? Oh, I downloaded it from this guy's blog. It's called Scott.net. He made a copy of .NET and search and replaced all the namespaces. It looks nice. You'll support me, right? No, you won't. But it's okay to do that. It's okay to play. It's okay to have third-party forks. It's okay to have different versions, right? It's okay that at work you use a reliable version of .NET, and in your hobby project or your side thing you use a different one. Now, today, the .NET framework is only one version and it sits on Windows, and you can't do that. One of the first things that we wanted to do with .NET Core was enable the ability to play and to experiment a little bit. And I'm going to give you a little quick demo of that because it's important, because it's going to make development with nopCommerce a lot easier when you can do things in a more side-by-side way. If I go to Windows, Microsoft.NET on my Explorer here, I'm in C:\Windows Microsoft.NET framework. I can see these different versions. These are major versions. But right here we see 4.0. But really I have 4.6. It's all lies. It's all lies. You can't trust Microsoft. Let's say that you're working on 4.6, and then a young lady over here is working on 4.7. It works great on her machine. It gives it to your machine, and you're like, it doesn't really work. But you don't want to upgrade because everything works, and I don't want to touch it. I don't want to anger the machine. So then you put off upgrades, and you put off upgrades, and then she quits and becomes a node developer, and then the community suffers, right? You want the ability to have a side-by-side kind of a world. So the .NET Core, which is not .NET Full Framework, lives over here in program files, and we have different versions side-by-side, all the way down to the minor, even preview builds. So I could have one folder that has a specific private build of .NET Core and of things that are built on top of it. So if I come out here to the command line and I'll type where.net, you can see it shows up right there, right? It shows up at programfiles.net. This is not the Windows one, this is the .NET Core one. Now I'm going to go and make a directory. Oops. I don't know why that popped up. And I'm going to go and say, make directory, New York City. I'm going to say .NET new. Now my fonts are big, so this doesn't look as pretty as if my fonts weren't big. But here I can go and say, I want to make a new console app or a new web app or whatever. Okay? This is the equivalent of saying file new project in Visual Studio, or if you're not technical in Word. And I'm going to say .NET new console. You can do this in Visual Studio, but I just like to do things at the command line because I think people can see what's underneath. So here I've got a program.cs and we've got hello world, right? Now I can go and say .NET run. And then it says pause, it's building it, and now hello world. Now some people might say, well, that was a lame demo, Scott. You just said hello world. And it took like 3 seconds, right? And they're going to go 1, 1,000, 2, 1,000, 3, 1,000. Microsoft sucks, right? And that's not any good. But what happened when I said .NET run was there was a build. When I did that build, this DLL popped out right here. So what if I said .NET exec, and I give it a path to that .NET Core, that .NET Core 2.0 application, and I said like that. Okay? See? That's like 30 milliseconds. Just trust me on that one. So .NET Run encapsulated the I'm going to build it, I'm going to run it. It's the developer's experience, right? But when I go and put that into production, it's like that, right? And we're actually working on something called native compilation. This is a new thing that's coming in the future where we will literally compile that all the way down to a native like C++ type executable, and it will get even faster. That's going to be really cool when we do things cross-platform. Now, when I type in .NET -- version, it says 2.0.3. I happen to be running 2.03 on this machine. Let's take a look at our SDK. 2.03 coincidentally happens to be the latest one. But what if I said .NET new, and I made this thing called a global JSON file, and we said 1.1, what do we have here? Let's see what our choices are. 1.1.0. Try to absorb that for a second. See what's going on there? So now, instead of having this kind of, I don't want to anger the machine, kind of an experience that I don't want to upgrade .NET because it's going to require a reboot, think about having beta versions. You can have your well-done steak and your raw steak on the same plate, but they're not going to touch. This is going to allow a level of an experimentation and a level of power that we never really had before. We can also do interesting things like have published self-contained versions of .NET. So I could go and say .NET, let me go ahead and get rid of that global JSON. I want to say .NET publish, like I'm going to publish it up to my website so that I could go potentially upload it to my host. See, it says publish. You see how small that is? There's not really much in there. That can't be the whole app, right? That is the app, but not the .NET framework. So if I were going to take that somewhere, I'd need to make sure .NET was already there, which is real common, right? Oh, I want to put nopCommerce on this site. Oh, did you install .NET first? Yeah, okay, I got to do that. .NET publish -R, Windows 10 x64. The R is the runtime. I'm going to publish it knowing, in fact, that it's going to be for Windows 10. Okay? So what's in there? What's in there is a complete version of .NET in a folder. So then I could take that folder and put it on a USB key and run it on a Windows machine that doesn't even have .NET installed. But then you might say, gosh, that's a lot for Hello World. That seems excessive. We're doing a thing in the future called tree trimming. What was the function that I called when I said my hello world? It was console.writeLine. I didn't call anything else. Didn't call system.regularExpressions, didn't call into a database. So imagine the tree of all of the different methods that I have hanging off of my application. What if I shook that tree and the leaves that I didn't use fell off? And I trimmed out half of that stuff. And I did it as part of the build. You could then only deploy the littlest pieces that you need. That's also useful from a security perspective because if the function doesn't exist on the machine, it can't be exploited. Isn't that interesting? All of this being made possible by the decision to use .NET Core. I'm assuming that from your silence, you're just absolutely thrilled. I don't want your pity applause, so we'll wait until I do something applause-worthy. And that's fine. All right. All right. So with the .NET Standard 2.0, which is the one that the nopCommerce folks have been starting to be very, very smart about, it has double the APIs that we had before, and it looks a lot like the .NET Framework. So right now, they've chosen to target 4.6, but being able to target a standard library in the future is going to give them a much bigger API service, and that's going to give them access to all of these different APIs. It also means that when someone creates a plugin or something, it could potentially, depending on how it's written, be reused elsewhere. It could be reused on an iPhone or on a Mac or something like that, which is going to be very, very powerful. Now, the .NET Standard for the developers in the room, see if I can get back to my browser here. We've got some really great docs here. This is our new docs. It's funny to say that our docs don't suck anymore. They used to suck really badly. People who are my age will remember MSDN. God bless them. Pour a little bit out for the homies. It was just a nightmare. We have an amazing docs team right now, and we've got a great new reference area here, and this is what's cool about this. You can go here and say, well, I want docs on like how to use hash tables, and those will come up. But remember I talked about this .NET Standard and why this .NET Standard is important. The standard has different levels, and the higher the level, the more methods you have. So I want a hash table. It's not in .NET Standard 1.6. I'll check .NET Standard 2, and it's there. So you can go and look at the additional implementations that you've added on and the things that you've done to customize and see if the functions that you want are available on other platforms. Okay? So when we think about other platforms, if we go back over here, remember when I published for Windows? What if I published for Linux from a Windows machine? So now, I've got the Windows version of my app and the Linux version of my app, and the complete Linux.NET runtime right there. Okay? Now we start getting, no, what's your pity? You gotta own it though. Yeah, see how he's insisting? Like maybe other people will start clapping too. No, it's fine. So that's a really great, I appreciate your support though, sir. We'll hang out later. Let me see if I can really earn that though, okay? So this is not a nopCommerce thing, but it could be. It could be. What if I unplugged my laptop unceremoniously and instead plugged in a Raspberry Pi attached to my cell phone battery? And what if I didn't have my, let's see if it's going to actually turn on too. Maybe my cell phone battery's dead. I'm blaming VGA for this fiasco. All right, I'm going to reboot. And by reboot, I mean just yank the power and hope it fixes itself. So I brought a Raspberry Pi. Raspberry Pi is the tiny little $35 computer. And there we go, booting up. I don't have a keyboard or any kind of way to talk to it, which will be interesting. So instead I brought a tiny, tiny keyboard. This is how I do all my development. It also has a tiny, tiny trackpad. Anybody see the cursor anywhere? It's on the left. Up, what's happening? Am I blind? Top left corner. By the Raspberry. All right. Wake up, tiny keyboard. Tiny, 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 tiny. Okay. Yeah, I'm a pretty good developer. Sorry. This exciting? What are you doing, Hanselman? What a mess. Oh, for crying out loud. Maybe I should have just brought a regular keyboard rather than a tiny one. So in here is a web app. And if I ran it, what do we call this one? I don't remember the name of this app. I thought it was /raspberry. Yep. I appreciate all of you yelling out to help me when I make mistakes. It's not at all unsupportive. I'm going to run a tiny browser. So we're starting up .NET Core on a Raspberry Pi. Raspberry Pi doesn't run Intel, it runs ARM, which is an entirely different kind of processor on a tiny machine that still runs ASP.NET Core. Might you want to run your storefront on a Raspberry Pi? I don't know. Maybe someone in the back in a suit is like, that's exactly why I came here to nopCommerce Days. I was like, if I don't see nopCommerce on a Raspberry Pi, I will leave unsatisfied. But what this means, though, is that you can run it now in Docker containers. You can run it on Amazon. You can run it on Google Cloud. You can run it on Macs. If they, and I think they will, make ASP.NET Core 2.0 run on .NET Core and they run nopCommerce on top of it, the decision that they are making architecturally to support .NET Core, which is a great open source platform, the decision that they made to smartly start with ASP.NET Core, straddle the two environments, allowing you to have a great new fast experience with nopCommerce 4, but then also enabling the developers, the core developers, to architecturally start thinking about .NET Core is going to enable scenarios like Docker containers and Kubernetes and all the different kind of buzzwords that you may or may not know about, and possibly running on things like Raspberry Pi. I don't know. Do you think that this is well done? No, absolutely not. It's blue. This is another interesting thing. Am I going to get support for my Raspberry Pi scenario? No. But I will get support for my Mac or my Linux scenarios, right? Because those are supported. Microsoft allows this to run because a bunch of us on the team think it's cool and interesting, and it allows me to do side projects, IoT. You know, having Raspberry Pi ability lets me do fun things around my house. My son set up a hamster security alarm in case the hamster escapes. We wrote it in .NET and we did it on a Raspberry Pi. That's fun. We may support this in the future, but that's the fun part about open source. We wouldn't have even been able to conceive of something like that unless it was an entirely open source stack. Which brings me to that final point. What I like about nopCommerce and why I'm happy to come all the way to New York to talk to you all is the idea that the entire stack from every button on the screen all the way down is open source, but it's also fully supported, whether it be supported by the nopCommerce folks or whether it be supported by Microsoft. So I'm pretty excited to be here, and I appreciate you spending a little bit of time with me. And for the non-technical people in the room, I apologize if this wasted your time. But at least you know now that your storefronts could maybe run on a Raspberry Pi in the future, and then you can tell your bosses and they'll be happy. Thank you very much.